Let's talk a little bit about madness and murder and why they make such good topics for horror. Okay, first of all, I don't have any sources for this information. Even though madness and murder are frequent aspects of horror, there just doesn't seem to be anything written specifically about either of them as a whole. Most likely there aren't any articles on it because the horror of madness and murder are pretty obvious. Still, I think it's a good idea to discuss some of the characteristics of those aspects in approaching our works. But you don't have to use citations if you use any of the information in this presentation in your paper. Yeah, there's a way to cite class lectures and PowerPoints and MLA, but it's a lot more complicated than I think undergraduate students should have to deal with. And after all, since I'm the one grading the paper, I'll know where you got the information and why there isn't a citation, so you're in the clear. Let's talk first about some of the horror that is inherent in madness. I think one question that we tend to have about madness is whether people who are mad know they're mad, and more important, would we know if we ourselves were mad? In a way, it's hard to understand how some people who commit really atrocious acts could not know that they're mad. But if we think about it, on the other hand, it's a perfectly reasonable question. After all, no one can experience another person's mind. We can only know how our own mind works. We don't really have a basis for comparison. Another factor to take into consideration is that delusion is often a symptom of mental illness. And a person who is deluded as part of their madness might not recognize changes in thought patterns, emotions, or behavior. I think people who live alone might be particularly susceptible to going mad without knowing it because there is no one close enough to them to see changes in behavior or attitudes and either point them out or get help for them. You remember that narrator in the yellow wallpaper? Now, she doesn't recognize her descent into madness as that at all. She doesn't see that her growing delusions are delusions, and she actually believes that there are women trapped in the wallpaper. Now, that's an example of a person who is obviously mad from an external viewpoint, but doesn't realize that she's mad. So we can see where those questions come up. Now, we know that madness can lead people to act in ways that they wouldn't even consider before they become mentally ill. One of the things that scares us about the prospect of becoming mentally ill ourselves is that we realize we might become someone we really aren't and do things that we would find abominable. If we became mentally ill, might we harm ourselves or others even though we would never consider doing any of these at this point? That's one of the questions that makes madness such a good topic for horror literature. Another concern that we have, of course, is that mental illnesses that might lead us to actions that we would never consider if we were not mentally ill don't really meet the legal definition of insanity. The legal definition of insanity is, did we know that what we were doing was wrong when we did it? But it's possible that we might feel justified or even compelled to act in certain ways because of a mental illness. So, in our mind, we didn't actually know that what we were doing wasn't justifiable. And even if we've lost the ability to rationally consider and control our actions, we can still be held legally liable and face the rest of our lives in prison. And that's a very frightening thought, too, that makes madness such a good topic for horror. But of course, other people's madness is also a source of horror, right? And it's really often difficult to tell if another person is mentally ill, even if we spend a great deal of time with them. In fact, Psychopathology or sociopathology that experts believe might be an underlying condition of many serial killers can include the ability to mirror the personalities of the people that they're with. So serial killers, as well as others who suffer from mental illness, blend in very well with the people around them. In fact, one area of study of forensic psychology is whether people who are likely to become serial killers can be identified, and if they can be identified in advance of actually killing anyone. Then, of course, that leads to an ethical question of what we should do if we can identify them, but that's another story. Let's talk just briefly about the horror of murder. Now, in reality, of course, all murder is horrible. The notion of one person taking another's life is difficult for us to understand outside of war. Even in cases of justifiable homicide, such as self-defense, we tend to regret that a less final solution could not have been found. But not all murders are really good material for horror fiction. Of course, a good horror writer can create horror through his or her writing in and of itself, but generally the murders in horror fiction have a unique characteristic that sets them apart. One type of murder that lends itself to horror is murder without motivation. While we might not be able to forgive it, we can at least wrap our minds around murders that are committed out of rage, jealousy, greed, revenge, or some kind of an emotion that we can understand. But one person killing another for no reason reminds us of the sailor in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Remember, the sailor shoots the albatross for no reason at all. In fact, the albatross had brought good luck to the ship and seemed to be particularly fond of and even loved the sailor who ends up shooting it. The killing is so stupid that we have problems really feeling sorry for what the sailor goes through after he shoots the albatross. The needless death of the innocent is difficult for a feeling person to accept, even if it's by accident, and it becomes horrific if the death is both pointless and intentional. Another type of murder that lends itself to horror involves corpse mutilation and desecration. As far back as ancient Greece, corpse mutilation and desecration had been seen as so horrific that people would go to extreme measures to avoid it. In fact, it's one of the motivations that leads Medea to kill her own children. The first modern American serial killer, Ed Gein, who was active in the 1950s, actually killed only 2 women. But what horrified America was that his house was filled with skulls used as bowls and things like a woman's suit that he was making for himself out of women's skin. That's where the idea in Silence of the Lamb came from. Most of those materials that were found in his house he actually obtained by digging up fairly freshly buried corpses. So it's the corpse desecration and mutilation in that case that made his killings so horrific, not the number of victims. And, of course, cannibalism is particularly horrific. Even when people are forced to commit cannibalism to simply avoid starvation, we find it repellent and have problems contemplating it. When somebody does it for what other reason they might have, it is absolutely repellent to us, and that makes it a good topic for horror. Now, certainly, if there are sexual components or torture involved, murder becomes more horrific. If the body of the victim reveals signs of particularly violent rape or sex acts that are completely out of the norm, even in the most liberal point of view, we're horrified and disgusted at the depravity. Of course, if the murderer is caught and it's determined that he or she got some kind of a sexual thrill out of the act of killing and inflicting severe pain, that's so incomprehensible to most of us that we are horrified or repelled by that alone. Similarly, signs that the victim was tortured, especially over a period of time and for no clear reason, intensifies the horror of the murder. Of course, of all murders, those that are committed by serial killers might be the most horrific. For one thing, most of them tend to combine all of the other horrific factors we've already talked about. Generally, the victims are strangers to the killer, and the murders have no identifiable motivation. Very often, the corpse is mutilated, or at least buried in some kind of horrific manner or tossed aside like garbage. The bodies are sometimes partially eaten, and the killer might even keep body parts in his or her house as souvenirs. Often there is evidence of brutal, vicious, repeated rape or other sexual activity that is beyond anything acceptable to even the most open-minded among us. And some victims are held captive and tortured for a period of time prior to the actual murder. Perhaps scariest of all is that the FBI estimates that there are about 50 serial killers active in the United States at any given time, and the vast majority of them are never caught or even suspected. And because those who have been caught appear no different from anyone else, we know that it is possible that a neighbor, a co-worker, or even a member of our own family could be torturing, raping, killing, and even eating people for years without detection. Scariest of all is that because there is seldom any connection between a serial killer and his or her victims, he could become a target just by walking down the street or even just by posting on Facebook. So with that cheerful thought, I will leave you for today. Hope I didn't depress you or scare you too much, but that is the material that we're going to be dealing with in the upcoming unit. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me from an account other than Canvas at deborah.oakey@csn.edu. Thank you so much for listening to this brief and actually rather unpleasant presentation. Unpleasant because of the information it presents. That is, I hope that I tried to be as cheerful as possible in discussing such a gloomy topic. Go out and do something to cheer yourself up. Have a good time, and we'll get together again very soon.